Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia and today's Westpac Address. My name is Jane Norman. I'm a director here at the club and also a political reporter for the ABC. Today's guest is the Federal Treasurer Josh Frydenburg, capping off another historic week in federal politics. Far from being back in the black, this week's economic outlook or forecast showed that the budget is in fact deep in the red. Debt and deficit figures unlike anything we've seen in peacetime Australia, and an unemployment rate tipped to top 9.25%, the cost of responding to this pandemic. But now that the scale of the economic calamity has been laid bare, the government's next challenge is bringing the economy back into good health. Now, today's address is being held under COVID-19 restrictions. If you're following the conversation online, our Twitter handle is @PressClubAust and the hashtag is NPC. Ladies and gentlemen, the Treasurer, Josh Frydenburg.
Well, good afternoon and thank you, Jane. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleagues, the Minister for Finance, Matthias Cormann, who's a tower of strength for the Coalition and been such a big part of our strong economic performance. And I'd also like to acknowledge my other colleague who's here today, Senator Zed Segelsa, who's the Assistant Minister for Finance, Charities and Electoral Matters. Thank you for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, we are just over halfway through 2020 and it has already been a devastating year. From the drought to the fires and now COVID-19. Lives have been lost. Businesses have closed. Family dreams shattered. It's not right. It's not fair, but it is our harsh reality. Decent, hard-working Australians from all walks of life, through no fault of their own, are paying a heavy price. But despite the darkness, we have seen once again the remarkable spirit and strength of the Australian character. The selfless bravery of those health workers on the front line. Our scientists working tirelessly to develop a vaccine, and all those quiet Australians who are diligently following the medical advice and playing their part in defeating this relentless and insidious enemy. This is the source of our hope and our strength that we will get through this. It is our resolve and resilience that will see Australians through. 2 world wars and a depression didn't bring Australia to its knees, and COVID will not either. Today, I'm going to talk about where we are from a health and economic perspective, and outline the scale of the challenge we face and the uncertainty it brings. I'm also going to explain the steps we have taken and will take as part of our plan to support Australians through the depth of this crisis and help them back into work. Around 4 weeks ago, on the 23rd of June, Australia recorded 20 new COVID-19 cases. Yesterday, in my home state of Victoria, we had over 20 times that number. Over 5 million Victorians are back in lockdown. And it's a painful reminder of how quickly the virus can spread and the consequences that flow. However, we need to remember that 6 out of our 8 states and territories have had almost no cases and no community transmission. We must keep a sense of perspective. In Australia, as of today, there are 175 active cases for every million people, whereas in the United Kingdom, it's 3,774 and 7,998 in the United States. Our success on the health front has been due to an early and decisive move to close the international borders, to strengthen our health system, and to put in place the right health measures. But we are under no illusions. And this is why we must continue to support efforts to develop a vaccine. There are over 140 vaccine candidates in development around the world, with 24 of these currently in human clinical trials, including 4 here in Australia. The Morrison government has invested $333 million to support these efforts. But as long as there is no vaccine, there will be new cases and outbreaks. How effectively we manage these cases and minimise the economic impact will determine the speed and the trajectory of our national economic recovery. The economic mountain we must climb is steep, with the release of the update yesterday making it clear. Record falls in household consumption, business investment and GDP, with the official unemployment rate to peak in the December quarter at 9.25%. As the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister and I have observed, given the dislocation in the labour market caused by the pandemic, it is the effective unemployment rate rather than the official unemployment rate that currently provides the best indicator of progress in getting Australians back into work. The effective unemployment rate takes into account those people who have left the labour force since March and those who have been stood down. And as we saw from the most recent labour force figures, 210,000 additional people found a job. In addition, a further 130,000 people who are employed but were temporarily stood down found work last month. As a result, the effective unemployment rate fell from its peak of close to 15% in April to 11.3% in June. The shock that we are seeing from the coronavirus is considerably sharper than what Australia experienced during the recessions of the 1980s and 1990s. The falls in GDP and employment are around twice as big and occurred over a matter of months, not years. In those earlier recessions, the impacts were felt more acutely by working-age men in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors. This time round, women have experienced higher job losses than men. Young people have also been badly affected, making up more than 1/3 of the jobs lost. The youth unemployment rate has jumped to its highest rate in 20 years. Since February of this year, the economic impact of COVID-19 has cost us 3.5 years' worth of accumulated GDP growth and around 3 years of hard-won employment growth. All gone through no fault of our own. Australia's position is not unique. COVID-19 is striking many economies with even more devastating consequences. The World Bank expects more economies to experience contractions in per capita GDP terms than at any other time since 1870. The OECD is forecasting a contraction of 6% in global growth this calendar year, compared to an annual fall of just 0.1% during the GFC. Global working hours lost in the March and the June quarters, according to the International Labour Organization, are equivalent to the loss of 480 million full-time jobs. In the United States, data overnight shows that there are now 53 million jobless claims since March. I know it will be of little comfort right now to those Australians who have lost their jobs, but Australia is the only developed country to have its growth forecast upgraded for 2020 by the IMF in its June World Economic Outlook. And this gives us confidence that we are better placed than most other nations to chart a path to recovery. In response to COVID-19, we have laid out a comprehensive plan. We moved quickly and decisively to slow COVID-19 spreading in Australia. We did this by closing our borders and imposing a set of restrictions that would suppress transmission, but allowing large parts of the economy to continue operating. This was a deliberate strategy. We didn't go down the path of countries like Sweden, which put few restrictions in place. The result is that Sweden has seen over 5,600 deaths from a population less than half the size of Australia's, while still experiencing large falls in economic activity. At the same time, we didn't go down the path of countries like France, which adopted extreme lockdowns, totally shutting down large parts of their economy. As a result, they have seen a huge collapse in economic activity of around 30%, with some sectors, including construction, down by almost 90%. Notwithstanding these measures, France still suffered around 450 deaths for every million people. The French Prime Minister has recently said that they would not be imposing a lockdown like the one they did in March again because they have learned, and I quote, that the economic and human consequences from a total lockdown are disastrous. Instead, Australia chose a middle path, and we got the balance right. We have been clear from the outset that we are following a suppression strategy, not an elimination strategy. A strict elimination strategy would cripple our economy and require us to shut down many more sectors and not allow anyone to enter the country. Treasury, using OECD estimates of the economic impact of full lockdowns, suggests a 6-week Australia-wide hard lockdown could reduce GDP by around $50 billion. This is what is at stake. In contrast, we've shown that an aggressive suppression strategy targeting low or no community transmission can be effective when implemented well. And we have already seen this occur in 7 out of our 8 states and territories. The Victorian government has acknowledged that there were breakdowns in their quarantine arrangements that led to this new breakout. Provided we learn from the mistakes that have been made, we can get back to where we all want to be as a country. And we can keep our economy moving at the same time. As COVID-19 started to spread, we also took every step necessary to strengthen and prepare our health system, committing $9.4 billion towards the overall health response. This was used for the urgent purchase of personal protective equipment and other essential equipment to build the capacity of our hospital network, to provide Medicare subsidised telehealth services and to boost mental health supports across the community. Of course, even with these steps, the damage to our economy and to jobs could never have been completely avoided. And that is why we have committed a record $289 billion of economic support, of 14.6% of GDP, $164 billion of which is direct fiscal support, and another $125 billion in loans and guarantees and support with the Reserve Bank. Carefully designed to cushion the blow for households, help businesses stay in business and maintain financial stability. Of our direct measures, around $70 billion of support has already been provided. And Australia's fiscal response has been in line with that of other countries around the world, with around $11 trillion being deployed globally to mitigate the economic fallout from the pandemic. The centrepiece of our support measures has been the JobKeeper payment. It has acted as a lifeline for over 3.5 million people and nearly 1 million Australian businesses. And so far, this program has provided payments totalling over $30 billion, providing a much-needed boost to individuals, businesses and the economy. There are thousands of personal stories around the country, like Ashley, who runs an audio-visual business in Adelaide. As thousands of dollars of bookings were cancelled due to the pandemic, JobKeeper, in her words, acted as glue for her and her employees, allowing her to keep staff on and upskill the technical crew with in-house training. While Peter from Flinders Island Aviation in Tasmania used JobKeeper to keep his 4 staff employed as he provided essential passenger, freight and logistics support to isolated communities. Without JobKeeper and our other measures, the unemployment rate would have been 5 percentage points higher than we have seen. It has saved 700,000 jobs. And like so many of our other measures, JobKeeper has been helping lower income households. Around 80% of those people receiving JobKeeper in May were earning less than $90,000 a year before the crisis. On top of this, we provided direct support to those low-income households who needed it most, including Social Security, veteran and other income support payments recipients. Our $750 economic support payment in April provided $5.6 billion to over 7 million people, and our July payment is providing another $3.8 billion to around 5 million people. Like Jenny from Malang in South Australia, who sent me a heartfelt letter just last week, describing herself as a widowed 83-year-old renting pensioner. She shared how in 1 week the power bill arrived, her 19-year-old washing machine packed up, and her adopted greyhound had a tragic accident, leaving her with a $260 vet bill. In her words, suddenly your money arrived, I paid my bills, it was perfect timing. Jenny, like so many others across the community, has benefited from the support that has been put in place. And other measures include our $550 coronavirus supplement, which has significantly increased support for over 1.6 million job seekers. The coronavirus supplement is also being provided to around 600,000 other beneficiaries, including those on the parenting payment. And we have also allowed those who have lost their jobs or suffered a large drop in their hours to access their superannuation early and tax-free, providing further financial relief. It is, after all, their money. We know that almost 60% of those accessing their super early have used it or plan to use it to meet essential day-to-day expenses, including paying down debts, with another 36% adding to the money to their savings. We've also provided targeted support to help businesses survive this crisis, retain their employees and invest for the future. Our Boosting Cash Flow for Employers measure has provided over $17 billion to more than 750,000 businesses across Australia. Some have used this support to help cover their rent or their running costs. Some have used it to replenish their stock levels. Others have used it to hire or retain staff. Treasury analysis shows that without the various support measures provided to businesses, including JobKeeper, the cash flow boost, and rent and loan deferrals, another 200,000 businesses would likely have run out of cash by the end of this year. This unprecedented level of cash flow support was coupled with incentives for businesses to invest in their future to make them more competitive and more resilient. And this included a 50% accelerated depreciation measure, as well as a significantly expanded instant asset write-off. During the crisis, we've also made more than 80 regulatory changes to provide greater flexibility and protections for affected businesses. And while our focus has been on providing support to businesses across the whole economy, we recognise that restrictions have impacted some sectors more than others. This is why we have supplemented our broad-based support with targeted sector-specific responses. Take the Home Builder program, which is already boosting activity and jobs in the residential construction market. In June, sales of new houses jumped by almost 80%, and the Master Builders Association has said the scheme is delivering the most effective stimulus in a decade. Consider the specific support provided to the arts and entertainment sector, with $250 million in grants and loans that will support thousands of jobs and a further $400 million to attract film and television productions to Australia. Just as we have done to date, as part of our Job Maker plan, we will continue to evaluate the need for further targeted specific support as the crisis evolves. Credit is the lifeblood of our economy. Had it stopped flowing, it would have triggered an even more severe economic shock than the one we're experiencing. And that is why the third part of our economic plan was focused on making sure that we protected our financial system and kept credit flowing through the economy. We did this with the Reserve Bank, our other financial regulators, and in close and constructive partnership with the major banks. And thanks to this partnership, since March of this year, banks have provided repayment deferrals on over 900,000 loans, covering in excess of $250 billion in borrowings. The RBA established a new term funding facility providing incentives for banks to increase lending to businesses, particularly SMEs. Similar measures were introduced to enable the Australian Office of Financial Management to support smaller bank and non-bank lenders, with the government providing $15 billion to support their ability to lend. To date, around 16,000 loans worth $1.6 billion have been accepted under the first phase of our SME guarantee scheme. And the government is extending and enhancing the scheme as its focus turns to helping businesses recover and grow as the economy continues to open up. The results are clear to see. Credit has continued to flow. According to ABA data, the four major banks increased their total lending to SMEs by $2.2 billion in June. Taken together, our policy measures have been temporary, they've been targeted, and they have been scalable. They have been effective and achieved what they were designed to do: keep businesses afloat, keep people in jobs, maintain financial system stability and the flow of credit. But now we move to the next phase of support. And with restrictions starting to ease across much of the country and parts of our economy reopening, we move to the Job Maker plan. Despite the challenges in Victoria, there are positive signs that large parts of our economy are starting to get back to business. We are seeing this across a range of indicators. On the jobs front, of the 1.3 million Australians who lost their job or who were stood down on 0 hours at the start of the crisis, close to 500,000 had again started some form of work in June. Around half of this recovery was in the accommodation, the food and the retail sectors. If secondary outbreaks are contained, Treasury expects around half of those that lost their jobs or who were stood down on 0 hours early in the crisis will be back in some form of work by the end of the year. Of course, we know that some sectors will continue to be badly affected. In transport, for example, a key industry tied to international tourism, there is yet to be a recovery in jobs lost or the number of workers who have been stood down on 0 hours. There are encouraging signs also from the early bank data with respect to loan deferrals. As of June, repayments are now being made either in full or in part on over 20% of those deferred housing loans. As the economic environment evolves, so too must our economic plan to match these changing circumstances. The initial phase of our plan was focused on preparing our health system for this crisis, saving jobs and protecting the economy. the next phase of this crisis, our focus will shift to enabling growth. Because unlike past recessions, monetary policy is constrained and will do much less of the heavy lifting. During the GFC, the Reserve Bank cut interest rates by 425 basis points. Today, this would be the equivalent of up to $100 billion in fiscal support over a 12-month period. I repeat, during the GFC, the Reserve Bank cut interest rates by 425 basis points. This would be the equivalent of $100 billion of fiscal support over a 12-month period. We simply don't have that luxury this time round. We also don't have a strong flow of migrants to support growth. Due to lower net overseas migration, annual population growth is assumed to slow to just 0.6% in 2021, the lowest rate since 1916-17. This time, while we will continue to provide fiscal support through the crisis, sustainable growth will only come from creating the most dynamic and the most flexible economy we possibly can. And this is what our JobMaker plan is all about. And that is how we can get Australians back into work as quickly as possible. As we announced earlier this week, the JobKeeper payment will be extended for a further 6 months. This will give those businesses additional time to recover while encouraging those that can reopen to do so. Treasury estimates that between 1 million and 1.4 million people will continue receiving JobKeeper at an additional cost of around $17 billion. Importantly, JobKeeper will remain open to new participants, and if conditions worsen or restrictions become tighter, more people will become eligible and get the support they need. While we are seeing early signs of a recovery in the jobs market, the unemployment rate will remain high for some time. So we're also extending the temporary coronavirus supplement to the end of the year. And at the same time, we are making sure that there are strong incentives in the system for job seekers to take up new job opportunities as quickly as possible by increasing the income-free area and simplifying the taper rate. Individuals will now be able to earn nearly 3 times as much, up to $300 per fortnight, before they lose any job seeker payment. We know that the job market will be tighter for new job seekers and graduates. Treasury analysis shows that Australians graduating into a labour market with high youth unemployment can expect to earn roughly 8% less in their first year of work and 3.5% less after 5 years. The new National Skills Commission will help young job seekers to better understand the skill needs of employers and target investments to the skills and jobs that will be in demand. We have worked with the states to deliver $80 million for 80,000 additional vet short course places in priority areas like infection control training. Our higher education relief package introduced subsidised short courses to help Australians upskill or retrain in critical areas like nursing, teaching and science. And we're establishing a $1 billion job trainer fund jointly funded with the states and the territories, which will provide up to 340,000 vocational education and training places for school leavers and job seekers in 2020-21. We've also extended our 50% wage subsidy for existing apprentices and trainees to the 31st of March next year and expanded eligibility to medium-sized businesses. The extension will help 90,000 small and medium-sized businesses and around 180,000 apprentices and trainees stay in work and prevent them from losing a year of their training. These opportunities will not be fully realised unless we deal with our inflexible industrial relations system. The temporary industrial relations changes we have made in response to the crisis have been absolutely critical to keeping more people in work. Early survey results of the use of these provisions indicate businesses have found the changes to be essential to their ability to adjust and get through these challenging times. 3 out of 4 surveyed employers used the flexibilities provided for by the provisions. Almost all surveyed employers that use the flexibilities have said such access was important to keep their business operating and their employees in jobs. And 80% of surveyed employers support the continuation of the JobKeeper flexibilities for a further period of time, with job losses and business closure being the most commonly cited impact of not being able to use the provisions into the future. These temporary changes have shown us how big an impact a more flexible system can have. There is no doubt that our industrial relations system is overly complex and rigid. For the system to deliver more jobs, it will need to evolve to meet the jobs challenge the country faces. And this is the reason why the work that the Attorney General is leading is so integral to the recovery, and why all parties must constantly ask themselves, will the changes they seek create more jobs or less? That is the critical question for all participants. Our tax system will also need to play a role in the recovery. The pathway to recovery is not through higher taxes, but through a more competitive and efficient tax system that supports jobs and promotes investment. The Morrison government is already driving reform in this area by abolishing an entire income tax bracket and delivering the largest personal income tax cuts in more than 20 years. Over months, our legislated tax cuts will see, according to Treasury and the ATO, over $7 billion flow into the pockets of taxpayers as millions of Australians lodge their income tax returns. And during this crisis, we've also prioritised tax changes that support business investment, and will continue to do so, because there cannot be any sustained recovery without new investment. I am encouraged by the early discussions I'm having with the state and territory treasurers about tax issues at our Council of Federal Financial Relations meetings. We all recognise there is a need and an opportunity for reform in a very complex area with many moving parts. Our principles are agreed. We're all in favour of tax reform that delivers a simpler, more efficient and sustainable tax system as a pathway to more jobs and investment. As treasurers, we've also been tasked by the National Cabinet to take the lead in cutting red tape. And one long overdue area of reform is to improve occupational mobility by reducing licensing and registration requirements between states. Currently, there are over 800 different licences in manual trades alone. Based on our recent discussions among treasurers, we are well placed to make substantial progress on this issue very soon. We need to trust each other across the Federation. If an individual is licensed and registered in one jurisdiction, that should be easily recognised across the country. Another red tape priority reform is to tackle planning and zoning and push forward with long overdue changes. As the Productivity Commission has reported, these reforms could unlock around $1 billion of economic activity each year in Sydney alone. And this is what practical changes can do to help businesses grow. Ladies and gentlemen, the government has been able to respond to this crisis with unprecedented levels of economic support following 6 years of fiscal repair and discipline. This fiscal support, together with parameter variations, which are seeing higher welfare payments and decreased tax receipts, is having a major impact on our budget position. This was unavoidable. The underlying cash deficit is now expected to be $85.8 billion, or 4.3% of GDP in 1920, increasing to $184.5 billion, or 9.7% of GDP in 2020-21. These are daunting figures. These are eye-watering figures and reveal the impact on the budget of COVID-19. Government debt levels have increased sharply, with net debt expected to reach $667 billion, or 35.7% of GDP at the end of June next year. But even at these levels, our net debt to GDP ratio is significantly below that of comparable countries, with the average net debt to GDP ratio of many advanced economies expected to exceed 100% in 2020. Notwithstanding our relatively strong position, we remain focused on protecting the structural integrity of the budget, with almost 99% of the spending committed in response to the crisis occurring over just 2 years, 1920 and 2021. As our economy recovers, so too will our budget position. And with historically low interest rates, our debt levels remain manageable. The weighted average cost of our new borrowing assumed in this update is only around 0.8%, down from around 2.8% only 2 years ago in the 18-19 budget. Growing our economy will be a key to reducing our debt as a share of GDP. Let me illustrate this. With the benefit of low interest rates, returning to trend growth, and bringing the budget back to balance, we will see our gross debt as a share of GDP reduced by around 1.5 percentage points per year. So as you grow the economy faster than your debt levels are rising, you can reduce your debt to GDP ratio. We have demonstrated that we can run a balanced budget before, and we will do it again. Just as growth will be key to getting more Australians back into work, so too it will underpin our fiscal repair strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, this is a difficult time for Australians. It will test many of us like we have never been tested before. No one should underestimate the size of the mountain that we have to climb. But we can be confident that as a nation we have the ability to manage these challenges, and we have the plan to do it. Underpinning the recovery has been a strong spirit of collaboration right across the country. From the Commonwealth and the states and the territories through the new National Cabinet. From our big cities to our small towns. From businesses to the unions and the banks. Australians have come together to tackle this crisis. And if we continue to work together in the spirit of cooperation that we have shown in our response to date, we will emerge stronger. There is hope for the future. Thank you.
Well, Treasurer, thank you for your speech today. You've said that growth is key, but according to the economic update, one thing that's barely growing is the population. Overseas migration's down, the fertility rate has fallen. Given that you can't reopen the borders just yet, what incentives are you going to provide Australians to start having more babies to try and encourage the next baby boom?
Well, you are absolutely right. With that population growth effectively being halved from 1.2 down to 0.6, that takes into account both the migration levels but also the fertility rates. I think the best thing that we can do to encourage more children being born across the country is obviously to create a strong economy for them to be born into. We've provided lots of incentives for families. We've provided much increased funding for childcare. And of course, we are very much supporting families across the board in terms of our policies. So I won't go as far as to say, like Peter Costello, one for the mother, one for the father, and one for the country. But what I can say is people should feel encouraged about the future, and the more children that we have across the country, together with our migration, will build our population growth, and that will be good for the economy.
All right. If I can just remind journalists to stick to one question per person, and also just to stand at the microphone until the answer is completed. But our first question today is from Sarah Ison at the West Australian.
Treasurer, you pointed out how well we're doing compared to other countries. On some of the things that have helped the economy not be as bad as it could be, the PM has said our trade with China is stronger than it ever has been, especially in the resources sector. You've said the resources sector is one of the bright spots of our economy. How long are either of these trends, though? How long can we expect them to last, given tensions with China have been growing over the last 6 months? And also, the forecast for resource investment is down from MyEFO. We were forecasting 12% next year. Yesterday, it's gone down to 9.5%. So are these two strengths set to fade in coming years?
Well, actually, we're starting to see strong investment come back in the mining sector, and the reason being, as you know, it went from an investment stage to a production stage, and now it's getting back to the investment stage. And so we're very confident and optimistic about our resources sector, and particularly because the demand continues from China and from other countries. I mean, we've seen the iron ore price being elevated at around $100 a tonne. We have it in our update yesterday pretty modestly at $55 a tonne with an extended glide path. So the China-Australia relationship is absolutely critical. It's not just important in terms of resources, it's much more broadly. And if you look, for example, from Western Australia, which is the key iron ore producer for our country, we are supporting China with 66% of their iron ore. Now, that is key to their economic development. That number has elevated over time as Brazil has had some supply constraints. So we're very much focused as a government on ensuring we have a strong economic partnership with China. It's mutually beneficial. It's more than $200 billion annually. But at the same time, when it comes to our relationship with China, we will have our principled, consistent and clear positions. So, for example, when it came to the outbreak of coronavirus, we supported an independent inquiry by the appropriate international health agency. And we don't take a backward step, and we're very pleased a number of other countries supported that call. So we'll continue to speak out for Australia's national interest with China. As the Prime Minister has repeatedly said, we haven't done anything different. But at the same time, that economic partnership is critical to both our countries.
But the Brazil supply constraints, surely they're not going to last forever. Won't that then change things once that...
If we can keep questions to one person, sorry, there's just too many journos today.
Well, in terms of China, it will continue to have strong demand, be it with Brazil coming on with additional supply or on its own.
All right, next question from Phil Curry from the Fin Review.
Treasurer Phil Curry from the AFO. On your employment forecast for both effective and real the unemployment rate, is that predicated on an extension of the Fair Work Act exemptions for recipients and non-recipients of JobKeeper? And are you prepared to make that exemption, say, just for 3 months or no more than 6 to secure the chances of getting Labor on board?
Look, it's based on decisions at this point in time. But what we're obviously seeking is an extension of those IR flexible arrangements that we agreed with the initial rollout of JobKeeper. And as you know, those IR arrangements only continue till the end of September. So we will require new legislation, and we are endeavouring to put that legislation to the Parliament. At the same time, we put our extension of JobKeeper, because in order to implement what we announced the other day for the March quarter, we will need new legislation as well. But I want to emphasise why we believe we need this additional labour market flexibility. And it goes to the responses that businesses themselves are giving. Namely, 75% of these businesses have said that they've used these more flexible arrangements, these JobKeeper directions that they can make, around whether it's duties or whether it's changed in hours or whether it's changed location to help them get through the COVID crisis. Now, we want that extended not just for those JobKeeper eligible businesses that will continue with the program after September. We want JobKeeper businesses who are using that program today to continue to get it, because we're in such a difficult economic environment that those businesses, if they were eligible for JobKeeper today, have met that threshold of their reduced turnover of 30 or 50%, depending on their size. So they've been through a distressed period and they're still going to be struggling to get back on their feet while no vaccine is around. So we would like those temporary changes to continue. We're saying to the end of March, because that's what we have announced. The other key point I want to make, Phil, is that there are lots of protections in there for the employees. You have to give notice. You have to consult. You have to have a reasonable request. It has to be a safe working environment. It has to be consistent with the business's purpose and their usual operations. There's also still the protections for the employees, as there should be, around occupational health and safety, around adverse actions, around coercion, around unfair dismissal. So these changes are absolutely sensible given the economic environment that they're in. There's an alignment of interests here between employers on the one hand and employees. And if you look at the number of cases that have gone to either the Fair Work Commission or the Fair Work Ombudsman, they're not a large number of cases consisting the breadth of this program, 3.5 million workers and nearly 1 million businesses. So we very strongly believe that the JobKeeper flexible arrangements should continue until the end of March, not just for this cohort of businesses that will continue to receive JobKeeper, but also for those businesses that are currently today on JobKeeper.
Patrick Cummins.
Thanks, Treasurer. Patrick Cummins from The Australian. You talked a little about the reform agenda that you have, the growth agenda. And then back earlier this year when the coronavirus was first hitting the economy, Philip Lowe was talking about we can't return to business as usual. Sure. If you get all of your wish list here, if you do get the IR reforms, is this enough to achieve that step change in growth, in potential growth, to get us out of debt and to get us back on an even stronger growth trajectory? Is that some of the way, most of the way, everything we need to do?
Well, the reform agenda is never done. And you've got to seek every opportunity. And that's why I'm really encouraged by that spirit of collaboration with the Treasurers, who National Cabinet has now meeting every fortnight. So we meet in alternative fortnights to the meeting of National Cabinet. And we have a range of issues that are on our agenda. Bringing together the various national partnership agreements, tax reform, deregulation, occupational licensing. All those issues are on our agenda. We've already played a role in helping to secure the health agreement, the 5-year health agreement. There's lots of things we've been doing as Treasurers as part of that broader economic relationship. So I'm encouraged about what we can do with the states in this new spirit of cooperation, this new opportunity. There will obviously be more announcements about reforms in the context of the budget. But what the Prime Minister has already outlined is a very significant range of measures that we have underway, whether it's the skills agenda. I mean, just last week we announced a $2 billion skills package, including the $1.5 billion for the extension of the wage subsidy for 180,000 apprentices, but also, importantly, this new agreement with the states around efficient pricing and around creating 340,000 new training places. So there's a lot of reforms, whether it's skills, infrastructure, tax, flexible industrial relations or cutting red tape, that I think will drive further reform and further growth. And obviously what I referred to in terms of meeting this higher debt burden is if we can get back to balanced budgets, which Matthias knows all too well, which we were able to achieve for the first time in 11 years, together with those low interest rates, together with trend growth, which is about 2.75%, then we can see our debt levels as a proportion of GDP come down by 1.5% per year. Now that's a gross debt level, which is expected to get to 45%. That is going to be a significant step forward for the country.
Next question is from Shane Wright from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
Treasurer Shane Wright from The Age and the SMH. According to PwC, my daughter, who was born in 2006, will be 54 by the time the debt run up over the last 6 months is paid off. Is that correct? And going to your point about interest rates, the budget update you released yesterday, does that assume that record low interest rates, the lowest that we've had in 450 years, are going to continue and allow you to benefit from really low interest repayments on that debt?
Well, there's certainly this debt burden's going to be with you, with me, with our children for in the years ahead. It's just the harsh reality of what we're doing. But as Matthias said yesterday, what was our other alternative? What else could have we done except spend through this crisis to support Australians? Now, in terms of what our expectations are about interest rates, obviously that takes into account medium-term projections, and they're going to be in the context of the budget. What we announced yesterday, given the uncertainty, was numbers for 1920 and 2021. But you've heard very clearly, Shane, from the Governor himself that we are expecting low interest rates to be around for some time. Now, that's not good news for savers. It is good news for borrowers. And in terms of the government, it means that there is more work for fiscal side of public policy as opposed to the monetary policy side, because monetary policy doesn't have that room to move. It did during the GFC, 425 basis points, the interest rates came down, equivalent to around $100 billion stimulus to the economy over 12 months. We don't have that luxury. Interest rates only came down by 50 basis points in the context of COVID-19. So I'd say to your daughter, we are going to be paying back this debt for some time to come. But if we continue to adopt fiscal discipline, not austerity, we're rejecting the austerity. We're not a government of austerity. We're a government that will support the economy at a time that they need it. But we will also be disciplined. We'll also be very disciplined as a government, and we'll grow that economy. And I do want to point out that the Australian economy pre-COVID was 16% higher than it was when we came, larger than when we came to government. So we've done it before, and we'll do it again.
Andrew Probyn.
Treasurer Andrew Probyn from the ABC. You talked before about how you'd extended the early withdrawal of super.
Yeah.
The industry itself reckons that in the time since you announced that, 500,000 people have completely wiped their super balances, and by the end of this program, could be about 750,000. Does it bother you that because many of those people are low paid, women, young people, a bit older than Molly, that up to about $50 billion of effective stimulus has come from the savings of some of Australia's most vulnerable workers? And will you extend this program? Are you going to consider extending this program beyond next year?
Well, what we've announced is to extend that program to the point that people can draw down, not just till September, but they can draw down till the end of the year. And we've done so in terms of 2 lots of $10,000, Andrew. Now, this is the people's money. And what the survey data shows is that 57% of people have been using it for their day-to-day expenses, including rent and food and grocery bills, and we're living through a pandemic. These are unusual times.
You said 30-something% also towards their savings.
Correct.
Isn't super the best saving they've got?
Well, if people want to make that choice as to where they want to put their money into the bank and then use that money as they need it to spend through this crisis, then that is a decision for them. A number of people have paid down, for example, their home loans. But what we do know is more than 2.5 million Australians have seen fit to draw down on their super, to do so tax-free, because the government has made that allowance. And I also want to point out, Andrew, that pre-COVID, there was the opportunity to draw down on your super in the case of hardship. If you're going to lose your home, or if you had difficult health circumstances, you were able to access your super. And this is clearly a crisis for many Australians, so giving them access to their own money, I think, is a good thing.
Catherine Murphy from The Guardian.
She doesn't trip over the camera. I have a serious question, Treasurer, but I want to know first of all about the greyhound who you mentioned in the correspondence. Is the greyhound all right?
The greyhound sadly passed away as a tragic accident, but it was a beautifully handwritten note, and she obviously had thought very carefully about it, and she said, I'm 83 in inverted commas year old. They're two bad words. And she was very humorous, and I'd love to be able to speak to her one day, but it was just one of the many letters that we as politicians, whether it's Zed or Matthias or I or the Prime Minister, receive from people who are really benefiting through difficult circumstances through some of these decisions and support payments that have been made.
No, I'm sorry to bring us down like that.
That's all right.
Here's the serious question.
Well, she was upbeat given her circumstances.
Okay, righto. You've said that basically that growth will shrink the debt. You've said you're not a government of austerity. But yesterday at your press conference, you also made it clear that the government has abandoned its fiscal rules of requiring that new expenditure be offset. So is the government's budget strategy now trust us, or will there be a new budget strategy, and if so, what is it?
We are working on that fiscal strategy, of course, because we're living in such a different world, and we'll have more to say at budget time. And both Matthias and I indicated that yesterday. But what we do have, Catherine, is an ability to grow the economy. We've done that before. I mean, let's not forget where the economy was pre-COVID. We had employment growth at around 2%, which was twice the OECD average. We had the first balanced budget in 11 years, and Australia was living within its means. We had welfare dependency at the lowest level in 30 years, and we had legislated the biggest tax cuts in more than 20 years, $300 billion worth of tax cuts over just the last two budgets alone. So we had put the economy in a strong position to deal with this crisis by being able to spend with the financial firepower that we needed. Now, going forward, the key is not higher taxes. The key is not to cut essential services. In fact, spending on essential services is been going up by this government, whether it's health, hospitals or whether it's schools. So what we will continue to do is create incentives. And so when we put in place tax cuts or business incentives, or try to cut red tape, or go to the supply side of the equation, that's going to be critical. I noticed in the Financial Review today they were saying, you know, everyone's a Keynesian and thinking about income support. It's important to go to the supply side. Thatcher, Reagan, that's an inspiration. Supply side can actually help create and strengthen the economy, and that's what we're determined to do. Provide a boost to aggregate demand where appropriate, but to encourage supply-side reforms, because that is going to be important to the recovery.
Treasurer, we're getting close to 1:30, but given that your speech went a little bit over time, are you happy to go over time for a few more journalists?
Sure.
All right, Katina Curtis from the AAP.
Thanks, Treasurer. Talking about looking at the numbers you released yesterday,
yeah.
Wages growth is looking pretty low, and that's not surprising, but wages have been stagnating for some time now. Are you worried that if people don't get more in their pay packets for quite a while, that will hinder economic growth because they just won't have the money to go out there and spend?
Well, consumption was down quite significantly, and consumption is 60% of GDP. So boosting aggregate demand and the ability of those who have a propensity to spend is an important part of the economy. And so our $750 cash payments, including to Jenny in South Australia, was really important because not only did it help them meet their bills, but it also helped boost aggregate demand across the economy. And so we're seeking to put more money into people's pockets. That's what tax cuts do, for example, as well. But at the same time, the key to driving wages is going to have a tighter wages to go up is going to have a tighter labour market. And after a pandemic, or even in the middle of a pandemic, when the labour market has had such a shock, there's going to be spare capacity. And so that is a necessary that's a understandable or inevitable consequence of what we have gone through. And when there is spare capacity in the labour market and less competition for labour, then you're going to see an impact on wages.
Mark Kenny.
Treasurer Mark Kenny from the ANU and also from the Press Club Board. Just going back to Jane's opening question briefly, I'm a bit confused. The PM was saying that we should come out from under the doona earlier on when we were talking about restrictions. You seem to want Australians to go back under the doona. Is that correct?
Not at all. Although the doona is probably big enough for two of us, but I think it's really important that we follow the medical advice, and that is the Prime Minister's very clear view. And with respect to Victoria, it's very unfortunate what has happened there because more than 5 million of my fellow Victorians are going through lockdown, whereas in other states and territories the economies are gradually opening up. So the impact on the economy is very much tied to what is happening on the health front, and therefore we need to follow the medical advice. People who don't should be dealt with accordingly, but it is really important that we follow the medical advice at this time.
I should apologise, Treasurer, because I was really referring to the fertility question.
Oh, right, okay.
It was meant to be funnier than it was.
I'm glad the broadcast has ended now.
So now I can go to my substantive question, which is...
That's all right.
Pushing it right.
We'll go to my substantive question, which was about international comparisons and the situation you face.
Yep.
Your colleague Matthias Korn made the point yesterday, what else should we do? It's a legitimate question. It was the question also that Labor was faced with back in 2008. Many of us in this room covered that, so it wasn't that very long ago. Yet there was a lot of corrosive politics around it, and certainly in the years after it, suggestions that money was wasted and everything else. I'm wondering if now from inside this crisis you acknowledge that some of that was overheated, that it didn't do anyone any good. The fact that you were able to come here as a Treasurer on top of near enough to 30 years of unbroken growth was a function of the success of policy back at that stage. Does your party owe at least an accounting for its behaviour in the years after that GFC?
We were very consistent that spending would be supported, but not to bake in structural changes to the budget. And we have been very careful in our response to this crisis, unlike what we saw with Labor back in the GFC, and you've raised Labor, I haven't. And if you go back to what we saw under them, they baked in structural spending. 99% of our spending is over 2 years, 1920 and 2021. The other major point to make is that the pandemic that we face is the largest economic shock that the world has ever seen. I mean, in terms of quantum, the OECD have said that the impact on the global economy from this pandemic will see it contract by 0.6%, whereas under the GFC it contracted by 0.1%. That's effectively 60 times the size. But so it's a really clear point of difference. We're dealing with something here of a size and a scale that we haven't seen before. Our spending is very temporary, it's very targeted, it's guided by the principles that took us into this crisis that will take us out of this crisis.
Do you have a more compliant opposition than
I
you
think
do?
we'll have to end there because we have 2 more questions before we'll actually really run out of time. Tim Shaw.
Thanks, Jane. Tim Shaw, Director of the National Press Club, Treasurer. The High Court and the Federal Court are going to hear issues relating to the proportionality of restrictions imposed by states on trade. Treasury set some very big targets. Well, more than half of the workers going back to work in the next 6 months, Christmas. Outside of the law courts, who are the referees that can assist? Is it the COVID Commission pivoting to be able to receive submissions from business, basically saying we can't be profitable in the next 6, 9, 12 months under these current regimes? What do you say to those businesses?
Well, these are the sort of issues that the National Cabinet can discuss in terms of the impact across borders and the like. And no doubt that Andrew Barr is somebody that I've worked with across the table in the Council of Federal Financial Relations. But issues around borders are no doubt discussed in the broader context of what happens at National Cabinet. But what we want to see is business given the opportunity to thrive and to be a key part of the recovery. 9 out of every 10 jobs is in the private sector. So we've got to allow our businesses within the medical advice parameters to thrive as part of the recovery.
And the final question today from John Keogh.
Thanks, Treasurer. John Keogh from the Australian Financial Review, and good to see you've gotten over Carlton's after the siren loss last weekend. More seriously, though, the assumptions in the budget, they assume that Victoria's lockdown will last only 6 weeks.
Yeah.
That's looking a little bit doubtful, but let's wait and see. That the border between New South Wales and Victoria and South Australia will open up next month. And also that there won't be any other backsliding by states on the 3 stages agreed to by the economy. I've also been speaking to the credit rating agencies today who, as you would know, the AAA rating that was reaffirmed yesterday is not only dependent on the Commonwealth, but it's the combination of the Commonwealth and the states, including Victoria. They're doing a lot of spending now on the virus. Their economy is slowing down. Are you concerned that the situation in Victoria is going to weigh on the budget assumptions yesterday and potentially even the Commonwealth's AAA credit rating?
Well, I do note that Victoria in their announcements yesterday about their economy also used that assumption of the 6-week lockdown. So from that state, in response to obviously the pandemic and the changes to their own budget position, they used the same assumption that we did. Now, we can only make forecasts in this very difficult and uncertain environment based on decisions that are being taken. And we don't know how successful or unsuccessful states and territories will be in the future in dealing with outbreaks should they occur. And there are lessons to be learnt from Victoria, particularly about the quarantine experience. But what we do know is that states have been effective and territories have been effective in dealing with new cases. There will be new cases, and it's how effective they can be tested and traced and contained and quarantined, and how effective the social distancing laws are that will be very important in the future. I do point out that when it comes to state contributions, we welcome what Victoria's announced and we welcome what other states have announced. The states cumulatively have announced around $40 billion worth of support. Now, that's both balance sheet and also direct economic support. We've announced $269 billion of economic support. So the federal government has done a lot of the heavy lifting. And I think it's really important, but we do also welcome the announcements from the credit rating agencies overnight. For Australia to be one of only a handful of countries to retain its AAA credit rating is very important, and it does give us confidence about the economic climate that we are dealing with, even despite the uncertainty that that our decisions that we're taking are helping to take Australia in the right direction.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's conclude on that note. Please thank the Treasurer.
Thank you.
Let's prove our appreciation for 20...